Well, let's jump into the word. Philippians, we've started this series on Philippians, and we started last week. And I just want to encourage you that even in all that life has gives us at times, we are learning to walk in joy. How many of you have had your joy tested this week? I'm telling you, man. I'm telling you. Always know whatever I preach on is going to be an opportunity to walk it out. So I joke about it sometimes because I think, man, I just talked about peace, and then everything goes crazy that week. So we talked about joy, and even Chris and I were talking about it in the office, and this was before we even started the series, and it's amazing how just life hits, and all of a sudden you're like, you know what, I just talked about joy, and here I am today all flustered and trying to walk out what I'm speaking, what I'm learning. So just so you know, when I speak to this is something the Lord is teaching us, that I don't have all this together. I'm growing just like you are. But I'm more and more aware of the importance of keeping our joy. So we talked about it last week. And so he writes this letter to Philippi. We're just going to review here for a second for those who weren't with us last week. Paul planted the church in Philippi probably about AD 51 is kind of what the time frame is. And it came out of Acts chapter 16 when Paul and Silas are in prison. And they're in prison, and they're beaten. They're down in this dungeon. And they begin to worship God. It says around midnight, they begin to worship God and sing. And all of a sudden, the chains come off of them and the other prisoners. I mean, there's this miraculous thing that happens. And all these people, and here's the thing. Even though all these people are free, none of them went anywhere. You ever think about that? You've been in prison, and now all this things that have you bound are now off, and nobody took off. Because the jailer was like, oh no! And guess what? You know why they didn't take off? Because I'm telling you, there was a presence there that was more important than the freedom they could have outside those walls. But there was something I believe those prisoners were experiencing, because even the jailer ended up getting saved and his family. All because of this miraculous thing that happened when they began to worship in some of the most horrific time of their life, of being beaten and down in this dungeon, and they worship. So this is kind of how the church started. Well, then this is about 10 years later that Paul's now in prison in Rome, and he's writing this letter to encourage the people in Philippi at this church. So Paul, I said this last week, we're going to read this passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. But Paul has been through some stuff. I mean, how many know just having that story? You travel the world with your testimony. You be at church after church. Man, this dude was in prison and beaten in a dungeon, and God came in. I mean, the presence of God came as they worshiped, and that would be your story. But there was more. Now, here he is again in prison in Rome. It's about 10 years later, and I thought about this week. He's writing to this church that's about 10 years old, and I was like, you know what's weird is Thrive, we're 10 years old, right? So I was like, hey, we're kind of right here in the same time frame of as far as the time that the church had existed as this group. So here's Paul, and the reason why we can receive from him is because he knows what he's doing. He's living it. You know, he's living it. And here's what he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 23. Are the servants of Christ? I know I sound like a madman, but I have served him far more. I have worked harder and been put in prison more often. Been whipped times without number, faced death again and again. 5 different times the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and a day adrift at sea. I've traveled on many long journeys, faced danger from rivers and robbers, faced danger from my own people, the Jews, as well as from the Gentiles. I've faced danger in cities, in deserts, and on the seas. And I have faced danger from men who claim to be believers but are not. I have worked hard and long, enduring many sleepless nights. I've been hungry and thirsty, have often gone without food. I've shivered in the cold without enough clothes to keep me warm. Then besides all this, I have the daily burden of my concern for all the churches. So here's Paul saying, not only am I trying to help all these churches, but I got some stuff, I've been through some stuff. And when I read that, it just stood out to me so much more when I first started studying this. I thought, man, this dude has been through it. Because 39 lashes, and that's happened 5 times. That's a lot of lashes. That's a lot of lashes. A lot of scars. And, we're like, yeah, but I have to work from home. Right. I mean, I know there's challenges with that. I'm not saying there's no challenges, but lashes. So there's so much that he's gone through, yet this whole theme of this letter comes down to joy and rejoicing. And how can he do that? And we talked about how there's one reason why we struggle with joy sometimes, or we feel we struggle with joy, is because we make joy and happiness the same thing. And they're not. They're not. Happiness is based on just your circumstances. However it is right now, that's how, if you got, you get great news today, you're happy. If you don't, you're not happy. It's all based on circumstances. And I heard a pastor say, circumstances means kind of the circle you're standing in right now. That's kind of what it is. So basically, wherever you're at right now determines happy or sad based on where you're at this present moment. Joy is not like that. Joy is on the inside, and it's something that isn't changed by where you're at, what's going on. It's the presence of the Spirit of God in you. The Bible says, in his presence, there's fullness of joy. That's scripture. So in his presence, there's fullness of joy. So because of the presence of God in your life, you have the presence of joy in your life. Now, how do we walk that out? And we looked last week, and the first 2 things we talked about was focusing on others, because in Philippians chapter 1, in verse 3, he starts out by saying this. He says, every time I think of you, I give thanks to my God. That's what he says. That's how he starts the letter from prison in Rome. I said this last week. I would not start it that way. I would hope that I would get to that point. But most of us would be like, hey, I need some help. Y'all got to find a way to get me out of here. You got to do something. This place is crazy. These guards, they are not nice. This prison, it's messed up. It's dirty. It's not a good living situation. But Paul's not trying to get attention about his stuff. Paul's not saying, oh, it's just tough. Be praying for me. It's just really tough. You guys don't understand. You see what I'm going through? See how I'm being treated? And he didn't even elevate it like, I'm a man of God. I'm in jail. That's what happens. He's not even doing that. He's not on either side. He's saying, look, you know what? I'm thinking about y'all. And every time I think about you, I pray for you. I pray for you. You want to walk in joy? Think about others. That helps you. Because I said this last week, reaping and sowing, it'll always work. It always works. When you think of others, you'll find that people think of you. When you encourage others, you will be encouraged. That's how it works. Then the second thing we talked about was focusing on God, and how we know in verse 9, it says, I pray your love will overflow more and more, and that you will keep on growing in your knowledge and your understanding. And then in verse 10, he says, I want you to understand what really matters, so that you may live pure and blameless lives until the day of Christ's return. And one translation says knowledge and discernment. That you could discern where you are and what you're going through. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. We talked about it last week, but I would encourage you, if you weren't here, go back to last week's message. It's online. It's on our website. or the app, and you can hear it. But there's a question that we need to learn to ask when we're going through challenges. And sometimes it's like, God, how are you coming to me here? What are you speaking to me now? Whether it's about how I should stand, how I should walk this out, or what am I not seeing? How are you coming to me? And I told you last week, there were some things that have happened in me over the last several weeks, and I was just like, you know what, God, what are you speaking to me? What are you revealing in me? Because there are times that we don't look inward and say, you know what, is there something that God is revealing in me and wants to show me even through this? Even through this. Because we are going to have trouble. John 16 says it. John 16:33 says, look, you will have trouble. Jesus said it, but he's overcome it. It says in this world, I told you this, here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows, but he talks about the fact that he take heart because he's overcome the world. So we can get through it because Jesus is the one who's leading us. The Spirit of God is leading us, has already been through it. So that's how he can help us. But we're going to face it. We're going to face it. And see, it wasn't, sometimes we look at things and we see all this trouble and we see this difficulty and we wonder like, oh man, if I've had people that ask, I just wish I had more faith. Listen, sometimes it's not a faith issue. Sometimes there's things that God's revealing and showing you. Sometimes it's things to recognize. Listen, Paul, who loved God, was serving God. All this stuff was happening. He went without food at times. Not to the point of dying, but he went without food. He didn't everything wasn't always just like, oh yeah, I got everything I need whenever I need it, how I need it. But God will always provide what you need. But there are times where you go through things, and sometimes there's things that happen that's not necessarily a lack of faith or a lack of understanding. Sometimes it's like, God, what are you doing? And how are you speaking to me? We got to at least let God tell us. Because here's the thing. If you ask God that question, let him answer it. If you're going to ask God, how are you coming to me here? Let him answer it. Because we all have our reasons of how we think God would answer that question. But really, God answers questions the right way all the time. And he knows. All right, so here's the third thing, and this is where we're starting up this week. And there's only 2 this week, so you'll still get to lunch. Focus. All right, we talk about focus on others, focus on God. Here's the other thing. Focus on the good. It doesn't mean that you don't look at the trouble. It doesn't mean that you can't be honest about what you're going through. Because looking at the good doesn't mean that you pretend there's nothing bad. It just means you're not going to just sit and talk about how negative everything is. You can acknowledge, man, I'm going through a tough time right now. But then when you're asking the Lord to help you to see and to reveal to you what's going on, then there's some things that you can see to bring good. You can bring good out of it. Now listen, here's what Paul says in verse 12. Remember what Paul has been through. Remember all the stuff that he's been through. And now he's in prison now, chained up to this guard. He's in these prisons aren't nice places to stay, especially back then. And he says, I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters. So he's saying, listen, I want you to know this. So I think when I hear Paul say that, listen, I want you to know this. He's saying, pay attention, because I really want you to get this. Everything that's happened to me here, it's helped me spread the gospel. Everything that has happened has helped me spread the good news. Because everyone here, including the whole palace guard, knows that I'm in chains because of Christ. And because of my imprisonment, most of the believers here have gained confidence and boldly speaks God's message without fear. So here's 2 things that Paul's looking at. Being in prison, he's saying, you know what? I want y'all to know something. It hasn't stopped me. Being in prison, he's not spending all this time talking about how bad prison is. He's saying, in this, man, I'm ministering to people all the time. And the people that are around me, that are in prison, including all of the palace guards, they're getting the gospel. I'm able to share the gospel. See, Paul's finding something that's good out of his situation. I'm sure if you ask Paul, would you know, if you could still do all that and not be in prison, would you? I'm sure that would be yeah. But see, Paul wasn't looking at everything on the same line item. He wasn't looking at everything the same way. He knew what he was called to do. He knew what was important. And he's saying, listen, just understand this. That everything that's happened to me, listen to that word. Everything that has happened to me. That's what he says. Everything that has happened to me has helped me preach the gospel. And preaching the gospel isn't just with your words. It's with your life. Paul's not just preaching by what he's writing down. He's preaching because people are watching him. People are seeing like this guy has been through it. And as much as he's been in prison and been whipped and beaten, he is not moving on his stance as a believer. So he's seeing this and he's seeing like, man, this don't feel sorry for me. I'm still preaching the gospel and lives are changing. And then he says the second part, he says, and because of my imprisonment, most of the believers here have gained confidence and boldly speak God's message without fear. So it's not just the people that he's speaking to, but even other believers are seeing Paul still have joy in a difficult situation and still see good in what he can do in a rough, tough situation, and it's given them confidence. It's given them confidence to say, man, if he can do it, I can do it. It always builds confidence when you see other people who are going through similar things and you're seeing them make it. And that's part of the journey for us. When we go through difficulty, listen, when we lose our joy or we stop walking in joy and we just get bitter and mad and frustrated and we just want to quit, we just don't want to, this Christian that, I don't want to, God doesn't pray. He doesn't answer my prayers. You know what? We're just missing it. And we're discouraging people. Because I promise you, whether you want to be on, God is here helping me, I got joy, or if you want to be on the other camp, it's like nothing's working, it doesn't matter what I do, you will have people around you just like you. Because in your life, you will be one of these two things. You heard me say this. You will be a thermostat or you'll be a thermometer. The thermometer changes by its surroundings. You'll just be in a difficult situation, everybody's complaining, and you're just going to start complaining. Because you just adjust. You want to be a thermostat? You say, this is the temperature. And if you're around me, you're going to adjust to this temperature. Our thermostats are set. Some of y'all might be a little chilly. I was actually a little cold this morning when I was like up here. Y'all thought I was being blessed. I wasn't shaking. I was cold. But here's the thing. It's set. And everything adjusts to that. And if we'll walk in joy, you're going to find that people around you begin to step up in joy and walking through the same difficulties, but having a different attitude. Why? Because they see your attitude. And they see how you're functioning. And they see how you're walking through. And you're an encouragement to others. And that's what Paul was doing. Paul's able to rejoice and understand some things because he's decided, I'm a thermostat. He didn't say that. But he's like, listen, don't feel sorry for me. No matter where I'm at, I'm preaching the gospel. His standing up for God is what got him in prison. And he's like, well, you can change my location, but you can't change what I'm doing. I'm just ministering to different people. To prison ministry. But I'm still sharing the gospel. And I'm still encouraging people. And you can't take that. There's nothing in there. You see Paul talking about some of what he went through. But you don't just see him like, oh, he's honest and he's real. In Romans 7, he says, you know, I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things I want to do. And he goes with this challenge that we all have. But he says the answer is Jesus. So Paul's helping us to understand if we'll focus on other people and focus on God and even see the good. Romans 8:28, it's very familiar. But you got to look at this verse. And let's look at it here. Here's Paul. Okay, Paul and Timothy kind of wrote this because when you read the first verse, it says, this letter is from Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus. But here's what it says right here. We know. How many of you, when you say, I know, like if you're asking, hey, do you know how to get there? Do you know how to get to that restaurant? I know. That means, yes, I know how to do it. It's fact. Okay, Paul and Timothy are saying, listen, we know something. This is something we know. That God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So God knows, God is able to turn everything, something good out of everything. All things work together for the good. Does that mean everything's good? No, but God can take what the enemy meant for harm and bring something good out of it. Have you ever faced a situation where you thought, oh, this is going to take me down? And years later, you think, you know what? Man, I look back, and I can just see how God carried me through. I can see how God did this and how God did this. There is good that comes out of stuff. Everything that happens is not God's plan. I'm just telling you that. If I went up and slapped Chris in the face, he would not be like, thank you, Lord, I received that. He wouldn't. People have a free will to do things, and sometimes they exercise that in ways that are not right, and that's not God's plan. That's God saying, I've given everyone the free opportunity to make a choice. If you make a choice to do something wrong, that's your choice. God doesn't force himself on anyone. So I'm not saying every bad thing that happens is God, but what I am saying that anything that happens, God can do something miraculous and turn something good out of it. Because he's God and he's good. And Paul and Timothy are saying, look, we know this. Because Paul's saying, listen, it's not cool. Paul didn't sign up. Hey, where's that class where you get 39 lashes? He didn't sign up for that. But with all that happened, he's like, hey, y'all, everything that's happened to me, I'm preaching the gospel. There's still good coming out of it. There's still good coming out of it. And that's part of what helps carry us through, because the more mature you get as a believer, the more you'll begin to see what God's doing in a deeper way. You'll begin to see that there's some things that God has used in the circumstances you faced or are facing. And you'll grow from it. And there'll be some change that happens in how you process or what you thought. Listen, I'm just going to tell you as an individual. I'm not even talking as a pastor right now. I've been in ministry for 25 years now. Almost 26 actually. Full time. In other words, it's been my job, full-time job for 26 years. And I go back and listen to some of the messages I preached when I first started. And I just pray, God, whoever was following me, will you rescue them? I don't know what I was saying. And it's not that I was saying anything bad. I wasn't way out there. There's just some things that the more I've grown and the more I've been through, that there's some things that my beliefs have shifted a little. Not way off. But there are some things I knew up here, but then you walk through something and it's like, you know what? What I thought was this, now that I'm walking through it, God's revealing to me a deeper place of understanding and discernment in this area. And it's not exactly what I thought. It's not exactly what I thought. So there's been some things that God has tweaked. And can I just tell you, he's going to tweak some more. Because that's part of growing. That's part of maturing. So we got to keep our focus and let God speak to us that we can mature. And then the fourth thing, we focus on others, we focus on God, we focus on the good, and then we focus on what really, really matters. What really matters at the end of the day? Can I just tell you, life on this earth, according to the word, it's but a vapor. A vapor. It's here today, it's gone tomorrow. Yet 99% of decisions we make every day have to do with this little vapor time. But eternity, forever, and that's what Paul's saying. He's like, look, there's so much more that we can focus on. See, when Paul planted this church in Philippi, all of a sudden, over the last 10 years, other churches have come up. There's other churches, there's other people preaching, there's other things happen. And Paul addresses it in verse 15. He said, listen, it's true that some are preaching out of jealousy and rivalry. Believe it or not, there are people preaching that don't have good motives. Does that still happen today? Yeah. Yeah, it does. But others preach about Christ with pure motives. They preach because they love me, for they know I have been appointed to defend the good news. But those others, they do not have pure motives as they preach about Christ. They preach with selfish ambition, and they're not sincere. They're not sincerely intending to make change. They're not sincerely intending to make my change more powerful than me. But then he says this. Look at verse 18. But that doesn't matter. Whether their motives are false or genuine, the message about Christ is being preached either way. Now see, to me, let's be honest. And if it's not you, that's fine. But sometimes don't you think like, hey, it still ain't right though. Like you want that addressed. Paul's getting these letters. People are saying, hey, just so you know, there's some preachers out here, and they're talking about all this stuff, and it's not, their motives are not right. And I think it needs to be addressed. Paul, I think you need to pause on the letter to the Philippians here and reach out to some of these pastors. Call it out. You know what Paul says? You know what? Doesn't even matter. The gospel is being preached. I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that people don't need to grow and that we need to have conversations and help people out. I'm not saying that. I'm not just saying, let people do what they want, who cares? But I am saying this. Paul was like, that's not the issue. You know what really matters? The gospel is being preached. And I'm just going to, for those who are new, when I step up here, this is just my perch for a minute. Okay? This is just me. I'm going to get on a little soapbox for a second. And if I hurt your feelings, just know already I love you. But we can criticize all these teachers. We can talk about, those people, they're all. But I'm telling you, some of these teachers that we don't like and we criticize and they're to this and they're to that, can I tell you, people's lives have been changed from them. And we better be careful. It doesn't mean that you're not right. It doesn't mean that they're not wrong in a lot of areas. It doesn't mean that their motives may be. But I'm telling you, there's some people's lives that have been changed from a lot of different ministries. Some ministries where I have wrong motives, wrong stuff, wrong focus. We just have to be careful. Doesn't mean we have to follow them. Doesn't mean we have to agree with them. It just means that we have to be very careful to understand. If lives are being changed, that part of it, God can use. Listen, God spoke through a donkey. You think we have to have it all together? Bro, I said, bro, right when I looked over, I'm like, bro, sister, any of us, if You don't have to be perfect to be used by God. Because if that's the case, I'd be sitting here and there'd be nobody up here. So be careful that we don't get so caught up in all the stuff that we miss the message, that we miss the good. And what really matters is that people's lives are being changed. That's what matters. And that's what Paul talks about. And then I'm going to finish this. So in verse 18, when it says whether motives are false or genuine, the message about Christ is being preached either way. And he says this, so I rejoice. I don't know if Paul ever addressed those people or not. But I know this. He was trying to help these people. You're getting so worked up over all the little things you're seeing in people, and you're missing everything that God's speaking to you. Because you're getting so caught up in all of that. Doesn't mean you can't notice it, but don't get so tunnel vision on everything that you think is wrong that you're missing some of what is right. And then he says, and I will continue to rejoice. In other words, it's not bringing me down. It's not going to bring me down. Then he says, for I know that as you pray for me, the Spirit of Jesus Christ helps me, and this will lead to my deliverance. And then he says this, I fully expect and hope that I will never be ashamed, but that I will continue to be bold for Christ as I have been in the past. And I trust that my life will bring honor to Christ whether I live or die. For me, living means living for Christ, and dying is even better. Here's the thing for Paul. He's like, look, here's my two options. I live for Christ, or I die and be with him. For me to live is Christ, to die, it's gain. For the believer, it's gain. When you have a mindset not just thinking about this little vapor moment on earth, then you realize either way, we're okay. As believers, we're okay. Either way. And then he says, but if I live, I can do more fruitful work for Christ, so I don't really know which is better. I'm torn between the two desires. I long to go and be with Christ, which would be far better for me, but for your sakes, it's better that I continue to live. Knowing this, I'm convinced that I'll remain alive, so I can continue to help all of you grow and experience the joy of your faith. What does he want us to experience? The joy of our faith, and that's what he's talking about. When I come to you again, you will have even more reason to take pride in Christ Jesus because of what he's doing through me. So here's Paul saying, look, it's not even done. He said, I'm continuing to live, doing what God's called me to do. It doesn't matter what happens to me, whether I live, whether I die, I will have joy because both are good. Both will work for me. Both will result in a connection with God. And that's where he's at. So when you go through and you think about where you are today, I'm just telling you, if you'll look at what Paul is saying in this passage, and you'll look beyond just your own understanding and your own stuff, because this is 10 years later, and Paul's still encouraging them from difficult situations that he faced. And he's saying, look, here's for me. I'm thinking about y'all. I just want you to grow. I want you to let God give you wisdom and discernment in how you walk through this thing. I want you to see the good that's coming out of what you're doing in your life. And then I want you to understand what really matters. Don't get caught up. Don't get caught up in this stuff. You know what really matters in your life? We talked about it before. Your walk with God. You letting the Spirit of God lead you. That's what matters. You know what doesn't matter? How much money you have. When you're gone, guess what? Your money's, you're not up to heaven saying, God, let me get one of them places with an extra room. I got some cash. That's nothing. Your status, your fame. Here, hey, I understand. Work hard. Get promoted. Ain't nothing wrong with that. But I'm saying if your value's all caught up in that, you're just missing it. You really are. You're working hard to feel better when you could feel better right now, just with your walk with God. Ultimately, God has a way of promoting you better than you can promote yourself anyway. So let's just really focus in as we go through. This is the first chapter, but as we go through Philippians, I'm telling you, just know this week you are going to have opportunities to look for the good. You will. Doesn't mean you can't. You still need to make decisions in dealing with stuff. I get that. But it might not be a decision where if you have to deal with someone at work or something like that, you still deal with it, but how is God coming to you and what's he doing in you that you can see, you know what, God, you help me navigate that in a healthy way. I'm growing. Give yourself an attaboy or attagirl. If you see God do something good, see it. Acknowledge, like, man, I'm growing. God's doing stuff. So don't live your life frustrated. Let Paul speak to us.